I never expected that spending time with my dog while my husband was away would turn into the most exciting day of my life. This realization began a few weeks ago when my husband left for a work trip, leaving me and our dog, Bailey, at home. The house felt unnervingly silent during his absences, a quietness that seemed more stifling than the absence of sound itself. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to this, as his business trips were frequent, often lasting for days or even weeks. I never resented his work, as it provided the means for our comfortable suburban life, complete with a large backyard and a house that often felt too spacious for just the two of us, or at times it felt like just me and Bailey. Bailey, our golden retriever, had been my loyal companion for 5 years, ever since we adopted him as a fluffy, clumsy puppy. Over time, his presence became my anchor, especially when my husband worked long hours or travelled to distant cities. Bailey was always there, greeting me with a wagging tail, a soft nudge, and eyes that seemed to understand more than a dog should. Tonight, like many others, the weight of the empty house pressed heavily on me. I tried to fill the silence with music from the TV, even resorting to an audiobook, but nothing seemed to bring comfort. After a lonely dinner of reheated leftovers, I sank onto the couch with a glass of wine, and Bailey sprawled at my feet. He stayed close, as though sensing my need for companionship on evenings like this. I reached down, letting my hand rest on his soft golden fur. "You're all I've got tonight, aren't you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Bailey responded with a low, contented huff, his tail thumping gently against the floor. The connection we shared had always been clear. He wasn't just a pet. He was a confidant, a presence that filled the emptiness when my husband was gone. Over time, I realized how much I relied on his quiet companionship, which offered a comfort I couldn't find anywhere else. It wasn't just his loyalty or calm nature, it was the way he seemed to truly understand me, sensing the parts of me I couldn't express. The evening stretched on, the minutes dragging slowly. I aimlessly scrolled through my phone, looking at pictures of friends and their families, lives full of noise and chaos, which only made my own silence feel more profound. Bailey shifted beside me, resting his head in my lap, and I smiled. At least I wasn't entirely alone. I stroked his fur, feeling his warmth against me. "You're such a good boy," I murmured softly. His tail wagged in response, and he gave a satisfied sigh. Moments like these filled me with gratitude for the simple love he gave so generously. While it wasn't the same as having my husband home, it was enough to ease my loneliness. Slowly, the wine began to affect my thoughts, softening them as I sank deeper into the cushions. Bailey shifted again, curling up beside me as if trying to shield me from the house's emptiness. I stroked his back and spoke to him without thinking. "You know, Bailey, sometimes I wonder if he knows how much time he spends away," I said quietly. "I know he's busy, fulfilling his obligations, but sometimes I just wish he'd be here." Bailey's ears perked up, and he looked at me, his gaze filled with such understanding that it made my chest ache. It was absurd to think he could truly comprehend me, but in that moment, it felt like he did. "Do you understand, Bailey?" I continued, gently massaging his side. "You're always here in this room." As the atmosphere grew even quieter, the only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and Bailey's calm breathing. I let my hand rest on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, which provided the grounding comfort I desperately needed. The silence, no longer oppressive, began to feel almost peaceful with him by my side. As the night wore on, my thoughts turned to the life my husband and I had built. It wasn't bad. We had a lovely home, financial security, and a routine that worked. But there was a growing emptiness inside me, a void I couldn't place. The emotional distance between us had widened into a silent chasm neither of us seemed ready to face. Bailey nudged my hand, pulling me from my reverie. I smiled down at him, grateful for the distraction. "Thanks, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "You always know what I need, don't you?" His tail wagged, his eyes glowing with warmth, and my heart swelled. Moments like these reminded me how important he was in my life and the unexpected ways he had woven himself into it. He wasn't just a dog, he was my lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I spent the rest of the evening on the couch with Bailey, the weight of the day gradually fading as his presence filled the emptiness. When it was finally time to go to bed, I felt a sense of calm. Bailey followed me as he always did, settling on his bed at the foot of mine. After turning off the light and lying down, I whispered into the dark, "Good night, Bailey. Thanks for being here." As I said this, I had a sudden realization. The intensity of his gaze thrilled me. Perhaps it was the wine, or maybe the loneliness and longing for excitement, but in that moment, I felt something shift within me. This realization led me to act in ways I had never expected. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Bailey's tail thumping against the floor. He always seemed to sense when I needed a little push to start the day. His golden eyes peered from the edge of the bed, and he gave a low, happy bark, almost as if saying, "Good morning, let's begin." I swung my legs off the bed, scratched my head, and laughed as Bailey nuzzled against me. All right, I'm up," I chuckled. Bailey dashed toward the bedroom door, pausing to glance back at me as if urging me to follow. It had become our routine, his quiet insistence that life goes on, even when the house felt too quiet without my husband around. After breakfast, Bailey eagerly trotted to the sliding door, his tail wagging with excitement. I grabbed his leash, and he bounced around, his whole body vibrating with energy. A walk was exactly what I needed to clear my head and shake off the remnants of last night's reflections. The neighborhood was still waking up, the streets peaceful except for the occasional chirp of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Bailey stayed close, his leash loose, his steps perfectly in sync with mine. I loved this about him. His calm, steady presence helped ground me, even when everything else felt chaotic. As we passed the park, I decided to let him off the leash. He bounded ahead, his ears flopping as he ran, pure joy radiating from him. Watching him so carefree and full of life made me feel lighter. I sat on a nearby bench, soaking in the warmth of the sun while keeping an eye on Bailey. He was chasing a squirrel, though his attempts were more playful than serious. "You're ridiculous," I called out, and he came trotting back to me, his tail wagging happily. He flopped down at my feet, and for a while we sat together, enjoying the peaceful morning. I found myself talking to Bailey, as I often did when it was just the two of us. There was something comforting about it, as if he was a sounding board for the thoughts I couldn't share with anyone else. "I don't know, Bailey," I started, bending down to rub his ears. "Sometimes I wonder how different life would be if things were different, if we didn't get stuck in this same routine." He gazed up at me with his large, expressive eyes, and it almost felt like he was saying, "I'm listening." It was silly, of course, to think he understood the depths of my thoughts, but in that moment it seemed like he did. "Don't get me wrong," I sighed, leaning back on the bench. "I'm grateful for what we have, but sometimes it feels like something's missing, you know?" I exhaled deeply, the weight of it all pressing down. "Your dad's a good man, but he's often gone. And when he's here, it's like we're just going through the motions." Bailey gave a soft whine, resting his head on my knee, and I felt a pang of guilt. "Sorry for going on," I said, stroking his head. But Bailey remained unfazed, content to stay by my side with his head resting on my knee, his tail wagging slowly. His presence reminded me of how much I depended on him, not just as a pet, but as a true companion, a friend who was always there when I needed him. As the day continued, we returned home, and I spent the rest of the day on mundane tasks, letting the hours pass. Bailey followed me from room to room, his presence a constant source of comfort. He would settle in whatever room I was in, watching me quietly, as if to reassure me that I wasn't alone. Later, after dinner, I found myself back on the couch with Bailey curled up next to me. The loneliness I often felt during my husband's absences was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as before. Bailey had a way of easing that emptiness, making the silence seem less oppressive. Still, every time I looked at him, I was reminded of what was missing. I stroked his fur, feeling the smoothness of his coat under my fingers. You're a savior, you know that, I said quietly. I don't know what I'd do without you. Bailey responded with a soft sigh, his tail gently thumping against the couch. I smiled, leaning back and finally allowing myself to relax for the first time that day. The warmth of his body next to mine was grounding, comforting in a way nothing else could be. As the evening wore on, I reflected on the bond we shared. It wasn't just the loyalty or companionship, though those were certainly part of it. It was the way Bailey seemed to understand me, to see me in a way that felt almost human. He was more than just a dog, he was a reminder that even in the quietest, loneliest moments, I wasn't truly alone. I stayed on the couch with him long after the sun had set, the two of us wrapped in the quiet warmth of our shared space. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but in that moment, it felt like enough. The days blurred together and my life continued in its steady, uneventful routine. My husband's return was delayed again. Another trip stretched longer than planned. I told myself I was fine with it. After all, I had grown used to his absences. But as the days went by, I found myself relying on Bailey more and more. One late afternoon, I was washing dishes in the kitchen while Bailey lay in the doorway, his ears twitching at the faint sounds of the neighborhood. The golden light streaming through the window warmed the room, but inside, I still felt cold. I called out softly to Bailey, breaking the silence. He lifted his head, his eyes locking onto mine, sensing a shift in my mood. "Let's get out of here," I said, grabbing his leash. We didn't have a destination, but leaving the house felt like a small rebellion against the monotony. Bailey sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, his fur blowing in the breeze. As we drove aimlessly through town, his joy was contagious, and for the first time that day, I smiled. We ended up at a nature reserve on the outskirts of town. The trails were quiet, the kind of place where only the rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of birds filled the air. I let Bailey off his leash, watching as he bounded ahead, tail wagging with excitement. He had always loved the outdoors, and seeing him so full of life helped ease the ache in my chest. I followed him down the trail, the soft crunch of gravel under my feet grounding me. Bailey darted between the trees, stopping occasionally to check if I was still there. His energy was infectious, and as I walked, I felt the tension in my body ease. The cool air filled my lungs, and my thoughts turned to the life I had built with my husband. I loved him, or at least I thought I did, but recently that love had felt more like a routine than a deep connection. His absence had left a gap, and Bailey had filled that space with unwavering loyalty, offering me the solace I had been seeking. Eventually, I found a peaceful clearing and sat on a fallen log, watching Bailey explore. After a while, he returned, collapsing at my feet with a contented sigh. I scratched behind his ears, and he nuzzled against my hand. His steady presence grounded me once more. "You're my anchor," I whispered softly. Bailey gazed up at me with those familiar, understanding eyes, and I realized in that moment just how much he meant to me. His expressive eyes, filled with warmth, made my chest tighten. These moments highlighted how important he had become in my life, as his presence had turned into a lifeline in a world that often felt overwhelming. The sun lowered in the sky, casting long shadows over the clearing, and I remained there with Bailey, the two of us together, surrounded by the tranquility of the moment. The outside world seemed to fade away until it was just us. I felt a rare clarity in that stillness, as if the weight of my thoughts had been lifted, allowing me to simply exist. As we walked back to the car, I realized how much I had needed this break, this escape from home, from the routine, and from the constant worries that filled my mind. Bailey trotted alongside me, his steps in sync with mine, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for him. He wasn't just my dog, he was my constant companion, my anchor, the one thing that made loneliness bearable. The drive back home was peaceful, the setting sun colouring the sky with shades of orange and pink, while he curled up in the passenger seat, resting his head on his paws and breathing steadily. I reached over, letting my hand rest on his back, feeling a peace I hadn't realised I was seeking. When we got home, the house seemed less empty and heavy. Bailey followed me inside, wagging his tail, and settled on his bed by the couch. I sank into the cushions, feeling a quiet sense of contentment. The bond I shared with Bailey was unparalleled, pure, uncomplicated, and unwavering. That night, as I lay in bed with Bailey at my feet, I thought about the connection between us. It was hard to put into words, but I could feel its reality, filling the void left by my husband's absence. Bailey wasn't just a dog. He was my companion, my confidant, and in many ways, my closest friend. For now, that was enough. The following night was unusually dark, the profound darkness surrounding the house and adding a sense of pressure to the air, as if a storm was about to break. While Bailey moved quietly through the house, his footsteps soft, his presence was reassuring. I didn't turn on any lights, allowing the soft glow of the moon to guide me. When I reached the couch, I sank into its cushions, and Bailey positioned himself beside me, resting his head on my lap. The silence of the house felt suffocating, a reminder of the space my husband had once filled. I absent-mindedly stroked Bailey's fur, my thoughts echoing, "You're all I have right now." I barely whispered it, my voice barely audible. Bailey responded with a gentle huff, his tail thumping lightly on the couch, his golden eyes looking up at me with an understanding that made my chest ache. I exhaled deeply, resting my palm on his fur. It was just the two of us, and those words, though unspoken, hung in the air heavier than I had expected. But Bailey seemed unbothered. He nuzzled closer, his warmth enveloping me as the weight of my loneliness pressed harder. The connection we shared felt unique that night, more profound than just his presence or his ability to sense my emotions. It was something deeper, beyond reason or words. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting myself be fully immersed in the moment. The tranquility and warmth of Bailey beside me made time feel irrelevant as we remained in that stillness, my hand moving to his head, fingers tracing the gentle curve of his ears. He sighed softly, his tail brushing against the couch, and the sound of his steady breathing filled the room, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. When I opened my eyes and looked down at him, our gazes met, and for a moment, everything else faded. Everything but the two of us. My hand remained on his head, my fingers moving over his fur as I felt an unexplained pull, a connection so deep it left me breathless. Bailey shifted closer, his warmth filling the emptiness in my chest. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forehead against his, closing my eyes again, savoring the moment. It was a feeling like no other, a blend of comfort, longing, gratitude, and a depth I couldn't describe. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I whispered, my voice shaky. Bailey responded with a gentle nuzzle against my cheek, his tail wagging softly. It was as though he understood the unspoken bond between us. The moment stretched on, the world outside disappearing as I remained with him, the connection between us wrapping around me like a lifeline. It wasn't just his presence, his unwavering loyalty, or his companionship. It was the way he made me feel understood, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't sure how long we stayed like that, but when I finally pulled away, my heart was racing, my breath shallow. Bailey's eyes were fixed on mine, calm yet intense, as if waiting for something. My hand lingered on his head, fingers tracing down to his collar as I tried to put into words what I was feeling. But there were no words for this. No way to describe how much Bailey meant to me, how his presence had filled the emptiness in my life. I could only sit there, hand on his fur, heart pounding, trying to process the moment. Eventually I leaned back against the couch, my hands still resting on Bailey as he settled beside me once more. The weight of the moment lingered, a quiet reminder of the bond we shared and how much more he had become to me than just a dog. As the night passed, I felt a subtle sense of clarity, a clarity that didn't come from logic, but from something deeper, something instinctive. Bailey had always been my anchor, my constant in a world that often felt too chaotic, too lonely. And in that moment, I realized how much I needed him. Not just as a companion, but as a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone. The house was quiet when I finally followed Bailey to bed, curled up at the foot of the bed. His presence was a quiet reassurance that I wasn't completely alone. I lay in the darkness, my thoughts tumultuous but my heart a little lighter, a little calmer as sleep took over. "Thank you, Bailey," I whispered into the silence, and he looked up at me, his eyes full of understanding. It was as if he could sense my yearning for excitement, my need for something to fill the void while my husband was absent. A transformation began within me, and I found myself wondering whether I should give in to these temptations. A part of me had refused, but I couldn't deny the curiosity. I wasn't prepared to act on it just yet, but I couldn't ignore the pull. The next morning, the sunlight poured into the room, casting a golden hue over everything. I awoke with the weight of the previous night still in my mind. Bailey was already awake, sitting quietly by the bed, his tail swishing slowly. "Morning, buddy," I murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. He leaned into my hand, his warm breath tickling my wrist. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant. As I got ready for the day, Bailey followed me from room to room, his presence a quiet comfort. The events of the previous night still lingered in my mind, vivid and raw, like they had been etched into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, though I wasn't sure what it meant. After breakfast, I found myself back on the couch, Bailey at my feet. The quiet of the house felt less oppressive today, more like a cocoon than a void. I let my fingers trace through Bailey's fur, my mind drifting, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. For years I had buried my feelings, pushed them down to keep everything running smoothly. But Bailey had a way of drawing them out, of making me confront the loneliness I had tried so hard to ignore. His unwavering loyalty and quiet understanding had been a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed until it was too late. Bailey looked at me again with those eyes. It was as if he was telling me he could fill the emptiness inside me. I leaned in towards him, and he immediately knew. When I kissed him, there was a tension between us, one I couldn't quite name. It moved quickly, but I can't go into details. I let myself go, kneeling and turning around. What happened next was beyond my imagination. The bond we shared seemed to strengthen as we continued. It was incredible, something I never expected. After about 30 to 40 minutes, Bailey finished, and I sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "What are we doing, Bailey?" I asked softly, my voice full of wonder and confusion. He looked up at me, his golden eyes locked onto mine, as though waiting for an answer. The rest of the day blurred into mundane tasks and fleeting moments of clarity. I folded laundry, tidied the kitchen, and took Bailey for a walk. All the while, I couldn't escape the weight of our bond, a reality I could no longer ignore. By evening, I felt restless, a nervous energy I couldn't shake. I grabbed Bailey's leash and went outside, hoping for clarity. The air was cool with a faint hint of wood smoke in the breeze. As we walked to the park, the paths were peaceful, lit by the gentle glow of street lamps and the flicker of distant headlights. Bailey trotted alongside me, his steps steady and sure. We reached a quiet spot in the park, the grass damp with dew, and I sat on a bench, Bailey resting at my feet. His warmth kept me from feeling the chill. The stars above were bright, scattered across the sky like shards of glass, and for a moment I felt the burdens of the world lift. Bailey moved closer, resting his head on my knee. I ran my fingers through his fur, grounding myself in the familiar motion. "You've always been here for me, haven't you?" I said softly, and he responded with a quiet whine, his tail tapping the ground. His presence, the simple act of being with me, filled me with warmth and erased the lingering shadows of doubt and loneliness. Bailey was not just my dog, he was my companion, my stabilizing force in a world that felt vast and lonely. As the minutes turned into hours, I found myself confiding in him, sharing my fears, my uncertainties, and the pain of a marriage that had become routine rather than meaningful. Bailey remained by my side, his calming presence reminding me that I wasn't alone. His loyalty and love filled the empty spaces in my heart. On the drive home, the silence felt significant, not empty, and Bailey lay beside me in the passenger seat, his eyes closed as the road lulled him to sleep. I smiled, reaching out to caress his fur. When we got home, the house felt warmer, more inviting than it had in weeks. Bailey followed me to the couch, where I curled up beneath a blanket, and he settled beside me. His quiet companionship reminded me that even in my loneliest moments, I was never truly alone. I leaned back, tracing patterns through his fur, whispering, "You're my rock." His body pressed against mine, and I could feel the undeniable connection between us, beyond words, beyond explanation. It was something I couldn't fully understand, but I knew it was real. As the night went on, the house grew quieter, and the world outside faded into stillness. I stayed on the couch with Bailey, letting myself drift into a peaceful haze. Whatever the future held, I knew one thing for sure. Bailey would be there, his loyalty unwavering, his love constant. For the first time in weeks, I felt clarity, a quiet certainty that I wasn't alone. As I fell asleep with Bailey nestled beside me, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together.